Chicago. Morning 3 of the worst blizzard in 35 years, 26 below zero. The kind of cold that turns breath to glass and makes the whole city hold still. Colleen Whitlock was 27 years old, 5 months pregnant, and still wearing her maid's uniform under a coat too thin for weather like this, because she'd slipped out of the Valenti estate before dawn to check us on her sick mother, and there hadn't been time to change. She was the invisible kind of woman, the one who scrubbed marble floors in a mansion, where the help was trained never to look the master in the eye, the one abandoned by the father of her child, drowning in a debt that wasn't hers, carrying a nursing degree she'd been forced to walk away from 6 weeks before graduation. Life had taught Colleen to keep her head down and keep moving, and that's exactly what she was doing, cutting through the alley behind her mother's house, when she saw it, a man's hand reaching out of a snowdrift beside the dumpsters, and on one frozen finger, a ruby ring she recognized instantly because she'd dusted it off that man's desk every single morning for 11 months. She dug through the snow with her bare hands, and her heart nearly stopped. Cesare Valenti, 36 years old, the most powerful, most feared mafia boss in Chicago, the man who ran an empire from behind those iron gates, the man whose quiet voice made grown men tremble, and the man the entire household whispered had vanished without a trace 3 days ago. His lips were blue. There was a bullet graze frozen into his side. He didn't have long minutes, maybe less. And here's the thing every reasonable person in Colleen's shoes already knew. You don't touch a dying mob boss. You walk away, because whoever put him in that snowbank wouldn't hesitate to put you right next to him. And she had a baby to think about, a mother to protect, and nothing in this world to defend herself with but a pair of worn-out gloves. Colleen looked down at him for exactly 3 seconds. Then she took off her own coat, laid it over his chest, and started dragging 200 pounds of frozen mafia boss through the snow toward her mother's back door, a pregnant maid, in a housekeeper's uniform, in the deadliest cold Chicago had seen in a generation. Nobody could have understood why she did it, but before that week was over, the whole city would understand. She hadn't just saved one man's life. She'd pulled an entire empire and her own buried past out of that grave of ice, and uncovered a betrayal so deep it wouldn't leave a single corner of Chicago untouched. Because the secret behind why Cesare Valenti ended up dying in that alley was tangled up with a secret about Colleen's own father, one she was never supposed to find. Before we go any further, if stories like this one move you, hit that like button and share this video with someone who believes in quiet courage. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell, because you won't want to miss what happens next. It takes you 3 seconds the same. 3 seconds it took Colleen to make the choice that changed everything. Now let's go back to that frozen alley in Chicago, where a pregnant maid is kneeling in the snow, and the most dangerous man in the city has just opened his eyes. The back door of her mother's house burst open beneath the weight of 2 human bodies, and the warmth from the old kitchen rushed out like a hand reaching to pull them inside. Colleen lowered the man onto the wooden floor beside the fireplace, her lungs burning, both arms trembling with exhaustion, while the baby inside her shifted faintly as though protesting. She allowed herself exactly 1 breath. Then the part of her she had believed buried 3 years ago awakened, cold, lucid, precise. The nurse awakened before the fear did, assessed the patient, lips turning blue, breathing shallow and slow, fewer than 10 breaths a minute. She pressed 2 fingers to his wrist. His radial pulse was weak and broken, there one moment and gone the next. His skin was cold and glossy as candle wax. Stage 3 hypothermia, possibly slipping toward stage 4, the threshold where the human heart begins to forget how to beat. Helen appeared in the kitchen doorway wearing her nightgown, one hand braced against the frame, her eyes carrying all of their 68 years as they swept over the man lying on her floor without blinking. "Mom, get me the wool blankets from the closet, every one you have, and heat some water, just warm, not boiling." Colleen's voice didn't tremble. Even she was surprised by that. Helen didn't ask a single question. She turned away, and the sound of her slippers on the stairs was as steady as a metronome. Colleen dropped to her knees and began working through the sequence carved into her spinal cord during sleepless nights of clinical training. The first rule with hypothermia was absolute. Never warm the body too quickly. No hot bath. No heat applied directly to the skin. No rubbing the arms or legs. If the cold blood trapped in the extremities rushed back toward the heart too suddenly, it could trigger rewarming shock, collapse the blood pressure, and kill the patient in the very act of saving him, killed by the hurried kindness of the person trying to help. One of her professors had once said that cold killed slowly, but warmth applied the wrong way killed fast. Using her mother's kitchen scissors, she cut away the drenched leather coat. There was no time to struggle with a zipper frozen solid. Then she cut through the blood-soaked black shirt beneath it. The bullet wound appeared under the kitchen light, a grazing channel along his left side, about the length of a finger. The blood had congealed into a dark crust, because the same cold that had nearly killed him had also, by cruel accident, slowed the bleeding. She cleaned the wound with warm saline mixed in haste, her hands moving as though the 11 months she had spent gripping a cleaning rag had never existed. Helen brought down the blankets, 3 heavy layers of wool smelling faintly of mothballs, and Colleen wrapped the man exactly as the textbooks prescribed, leaving his face uncovered and his airway clear. She filled 2 glass bottles with warm water and wrapped them in cotton towels, placing one beneath his armpit and the other against his groin, where the largest blood vessels ran close beneath the skin, gateways carrying warmth directly toward the heart. Warm the core first. The limbs could wait. She searched through her mother's sewing box, heated a needle over the gas flame, wiped it with alcohol, and closed the wound with 7 perfectly even stitches while the man never moved. One part of her was secretly grateful that he remained unconscious. The other counted every breath he took the way she counted the last loose coins at the end of each month. Helen stood behind her, silently watching her daughter work, and in the older woman's eyes was something made equally of pain and pride, though she gave neither feeling a name. Colleen mixed warm sugar water, raised his head at a slight angle, and fed it to him 1 teaspoon at a time through lips that were slowly losing their bluish color. The sugar gave his body fuel to shiver, and shivering was the oldest furnace nature had ever built into the human body. 1 spoonful. Wait for him to swallow. Another spoonful. She checked his pulse again. Still weak, but more regular now. His breathing rose to 12 breaths a minute. The skin along his throat began to change from gray to a faint, almost timid shade of pink. He would live, provided nothing unexpected happened during the next 6 hours. Colleen sank onto the floor, her back resting against the base of a kitchen cabinet, and only then did she realize that both her hands were shaking, not from fear, but because every muscle in her body had been wrung dry of its final drop of strength. Outside, the wind still screamed through the cracks around the door, hurling handfuls of snow against the window pane, as though someone stood beyond the glass throwing sand at the house. Helen poured 2 cups of tea and handed one to her daughter. Then she drew a wooden chair closer, sat down, and studied the unconscious face of the man lying on her floor. She looked at him for a very long time, long enough for Colleen to stop blowing across the surface of her tea and follow her mother's gaze. There was something in the way Helen stared at the stranger that sent a cold shiver along the back of Colleen's neck, because it wasn't the look someone gave a stranger. It was the look of a person watching an old ghost cross the threshold of her home after many years away. Helen set her cup down on the table, slowly and carefully, as though she feared she might break something far greater than porcelain. Then she spoke, her voice so quiet and even that it nearly disappeared into the wind. "Do you know who you've just brought into this house?" Colleen opened her mouth to answer, ready to say the name that everyone at the mansion dared speak only in whispers. But Helen shook her head, and her next words fell into the warm kitchen like a knife driven into the center of the table. "Your father died because of this family." Those words hung suspended in the kitchen for the rest of the evening, and Helen offered no further explanation. She merely rose and said the past could wait until morning, that the living came first, then helped her daughter prepare a mattress for the man in the small room beside the kitchen, where the warmth from the fireplace could still reach him. Once night had fully settled in, the fever began. Colleen recognized it from the very first sign. A dry red flush spread across the man's pale cheekbones, his breathing shifted from slow to rapid, and his fingers began to clutch faintly at the edge of the blanket, as though searching for something in the darkness. His body was burning itself to fight the infection in the wound, a battle she could do nothing to help, except watch the boundary and make certain he didn't cross it. She dipped a cloth into cool water, laid it across his forehead, changed it whenever it grew warm, and every 15 minutes. Beneath the weak yellow glow of the room's only bedside lamp, she pressed 2 fingers to his wrist and counted his pulse. 96, then 102, then 98. High, but not yet dangerous. Not yet at the point where she would have to risk everything and call an ambulance through the storm. Outside, the wind never stopped gathering force from Lake Michigan before hurling itself against the row of houses, shrieking through the window cracks with a thin, sharp sound, like someone whistling through clenched teeth, and each time the old wooden house creaked beneath the assault, Colleen lifted her head and listened. Sometime after midnight, he began to speak. At first there were only broken sounds without shape or meaning, the sounds of a man lost inside his own fever. She bent closer to wipe the sweat from his temple, and suddenly those fragments arranged themselves into words, so faint that she had to hold her breath to hear them. Uncle Carmine. Colleen froze, the cloth suspended in her hand. The man turned his face to one side, a small rasp escaping his dry throat, and the next words fell from him piece by piece, broken and incomplete, like someone reading a telegram that had been partly burned. They sign on the 17th. Can't let them sign. His hand tightened around the edge of the blanket. They know I found the ledger. They know. Then his voice sank into breath, and his final sentence made the blood inside Colleen slow for a single beat. Don't trust anyone in the house. Don't trust anyone in the house. She remained perfectly still for a long time after he slipped back into silence, the cloth slowly cooling in her hand. Anyone in the house. She was someone in the house. For 11 months, she had polished stone floors, pressed table linens flat, and poured coffee into delicate porcelain cups inside the very mansion that now, if even part of his fevered words was true, sheltered the person who had left its owner to die in the snow behind her mother's house. Someone within those marble corridors had wanted this man dead. And on Monday morning, according to schedule, she would have to return there, put on her uniform, lower her head, and pretend she knew nothing. The thought of calling the police rose in her mind. Reasonable, safe, lawful. She even picked up the telephone and placed her thumb over the 3 digits. Then she remembered what everyone in the city knew about the Valenti family, about cases connected to that name that quietly died inside desk drawers, about how a call placed at 2 o'clock in the morning from Bridgeport would be recorded and stored, and who could promise that the recording wouldn't somehow find its way to the very ears that wanted this man to stop breathing. If the person behind this had eyes and ears inside the mansion, who could say he didn't have them elsewhere as well? She lowered the telephone and placed it face down on the table, like a card she wasn't yet willing to turn over. Then she stood and did what a person did when she no longer trusted anyone to protect her. She checked every lock in the house, the front door, the back door, the basement door, testing each knob with a hand that had finally stopped trembling. She drew every curtain on the first floor, leaving only a narrow gap 2 fingers wide at the kitchen window, just enough to see into the alley, without allowing anyone outside to see in. She turned off the light above the back porch, wedged the back of a wooden chair beneath the rear doorknob, the way her father had taught her during a winter long ago, and when she passed her mother's room, she stopped for 3 seconds outside the partly closed door, listening to the steady breathing within before moving on. Back in the small room, she turned the lamp low, sat in the chair beside the bed, pulled a thin blanket around her shoulders, and placed her father's wristwatch across her lap, its face turned upward so she could follow the minute hand in the darkness. Every 15 minutes, she pressed her fingers to the wrist of the man lying half-conscious before her and counted. Outside, the wind continued to howl, and the snow kept scraping across the window pane in patient waves, like fingernails that refused to stop. And inside the darkened little house in Bridgeport, a woman 5 months pregnant sat awake through the night, keeping watch over a delirious mafia boss, while one question grew heavier and heavier inside her chest. What kind of ledger could frighten those men enough to make them kill for it? And why did her father, a man who had been lying in his grave for 3 years, keep returning to her thoughts throughout the night as though he, too, were trying to tell her something? Morning came without sunlight, bringing only a thin gray glow filtered through the snow that was still falling, and Colleen awoke in the chair beside the bed with her father's watch still resting on her lap, her neck stiff, only to realize that her mother had been standing in the doorway for some time, her cardigan buttoned to the throat, her silver hair neatly combed, and in one hand the ring of keys Colleen hadn't seen leave the bedroom drawer in 3 years. "How is his pulse?" Helen asked. "Stronger and more regular." The fever broke near dawn. Helen gave a single nod, as though checking off an item on a list, then said, in a voice no louder than the kettle beginning to sing, "Then come with me. There's something you should have seen 3 years ago." The basement door stood beneath the staircase. The door her mother had always claimed was locked, damp, and full of nothing but broken junk ever since the funeral. The key turned twice. The hinges let out a long groan, and the smell reached them before the light did, the smell of old paper, dry dust, and ink that had slept undisturbed for years, the smell of libraries and notary offices, the smell Colleen would later remember forever as the scent of her father himself. Helen pulled the light cord. The yellow bulb trembled once, then steadied, and Colleen forgot how to breathe. There was no junk in the basement. Steel shelves covered all 4 walls, and upon them, lined up as straight as soldiers on parade, stood hundreds of hardbound ledgers in moss green, each spine marked with a white label bearing a month and year in the same precise, slanting handwriting she recognized at once, the handwriting that had signed her school reports, written birthday wishes inside greeting cards, the handwriting of Arthur Whitlock. 26 years, Helen said behind her, her voice still as even as though she were reciting a recipe. Your father was the Valenti family's chief accountant for 26 years, from before you were born. Back when Aldo was in charge, the father of the man lying upstairs in our bed, Colleen walked slowly along the shelves, her fingers brushing the cold, dry spines, each volume holding 1 year of an empire recorded by hand, debit and credit columns, every line written in ink that couldn't be erased without leaving a wound. Your father was old-fashioned, Helen continued. He didn't trust computers. He said a computer could be changed without leaving a scar, but paper couldn't lie. If paper was altered, it showed. So for every entry he put into their system, he wrote a matching line by hand for himself, and every weekend he brought the books home. No one told him to do it. He called it professional conscience. I called it a habit he couldn't break. She paused and looked across the rows of shelves. It turns out it was insurance. Colleen turned to face her mother. Last night you said Dad died because of that house. Helen pulled a wooden stool from the corner and sat, her hands folded together in her lap, and she began to speak in that painfully steady voice. Neither faster nor slower, as though one missed beat would break everything inside her apart. 3 weeks before that night, your father came home late and went straight down here. He stayed until nearly dawn. He didn't eat. He didn't speak. A few days later, after I kept asking, he finally said one thing. He said, "I found a stream of money that shouldn't exist." I asked what that meant. He told me the less I knew, the safer I would be. Then he smiled, that clumsy little reassuring smile of his, and said he would handle it the right way. Helen lowered her eyes to her hands. 19 days later, the hospital called and said he had fallen on a staircase in a parking garage and suffered a traumatic brain injury. He lay unconscious in intensive care for 5 weeks. 5 weeks. Colleen closed her eyes. She didn't need her mother to tell this part. She had lived it. The nights spent folding her textbooks and shoving them beneath a plastic chair in the hospital corridor. The leave of absence form she submitted 6 weeks before her final examination, while telling herself it was only temporary. The bills growing thicker with every week he remained on the ventilator. In the afternoon of the 36th day, when the lines on the monitors straightened into perfect rows. The police said it was an accident, Helen said. There was no camera covering that exact section of the stairs. No witnesses. The case was closed after 11 days. I signed the report because I still had a daughter who had to keep living. But listen carefully to me now. She raised her head, and for the first time that morning, a fracture as fine as a strand of hair appeared in her voice. Your father worked in accounting for 30 years. In his whole life, he never missed a step, not on a staircase and not in a ledger. Then she rose, walked to the far end of the innermost row of shelves, lifted a wooden board from the top of a low filing cabinet, and removed an old tin box the color of dead leaves, the kind that had once held cookies in some forgotten year, its lid speckled with rust. He gave me this 2 nights before he fell, Helen said, and he gave me only one instruction. If anything happens to me, keep this. Don't show it to anyone. Don't give it to the police. Don't give it to a lawyer. Wait until the right person comes, then open it. I asked who the right person was. He only said, "You'll know when that person appears." The tin lid sprang open with a dry snap. On top lay a photocopied ledger page crowded with columns of numbers, and in the center of the page was a circle drawn in red ink, pressed so hard it had scarred the paper. Beneath it lay a smaller piece of paper folded into quarters, worn along all four edges as though it had been opened and closed many times, and on it, in the same precise slanting handwriting of the man who had been in the ground for 3 years, there was only one line: "Give this to the heir. Only the heir." Colleen stood surrounded by 26 years of her father's records, the tin box slowly growing cold in her hands, and upstairs, directly above them, the wooden floor gave a faint creak beneath the weight of someone who had just awakened. At her mother's nod, Colleen returned the tin box to its hiding place. It wasn't time yet. Then she went upstairs ahead of Helen, and the moment she pushed open the door to the little room beside the kitchen, she knew the man in the bed was awake even though his eyes remained closed. There was a difference nursing school never taught, but hospital corridors did. A person who was truly asleep let go. This man lay still like a locked door, his breathing too deliberately even, while beneath those lowered eyelids an entire machine was running, listening, counting exits, measuring every sound in the unfamiliar house. Colleen said nothing. She walked past the bed, opened the curtain by exactly one handspan, poured water from the pitcher into a glass, set it on the bedside table firmly enough for the sound of glass touching wood to ring clearly through the room, then said to the silence, "When you're finished counting the doors, open your eyes. This house has 2 exits, the kitchen door and the front door. Both are locked and the keys are in my apron pocket." A moment of silence followed. Then the gray eyes opened, not with the slow blinking of a man who had barely escaped death, but all at once, alert and cold. They swept over her from head to toe, paused for half a second on the maid's uniform she was still wearing, because she had nothing else to change into, and she saw the exact moment the pieces struck one another inside his mind and failed to fit. "You work in my house," he said. His voice was rough as sandpaper, but it was still a voice accustomed to command, each word placed like a chess piece. "I clean the 2nd floor, Monday through Saturday." "I've been there 11 months, Colleen replied, her hands continuing to fold the stack of towels on the cabinet. "Where am I?" "My mother's house in Bridgeport, about 130 feet from where you were lying yesterday." He fell silent, and she watched the next question form, the kind of question a man like him wasn't accustomed to asking because someone had always answered before he had the chance to wonder. "Who brought me here?" "I did," she said. The gray eyes narrowed by no more than 1,000th, the only part of his face willing to move. "Alone?" "Alone," she confirmed. "And while we're discussing it, you owe my mother a rug. It was 30 years old and your blood soaked through it and ruined it. You also owe her 2 glass bottles that cracked from the hot water and 1 box of sewing thread. 7 stitches, left side. Don't twist too hard or 7 will become 14. She lifted the steaming bowl of chicken soup from the tray, placed it on the bedside table, then drew the chair closer and sat at exactly his eye level, neither above him nor below. "Eat the soup before it gets cold." The man studied the bowl as though it were an object that needed to be checked for explosives. Then he looked at her and spoke the sentence he had probably never once spoken without getting the result he wanted. $50,000. Cash. Today. You forget these 3 days, forget the alley, forget my name. And on Monday you go back to work as usual. Colleen didn't answer at once. She picked up the spoon and stirred the soup once to cool it, moving with the unhurried calm of someone who had made her decision long before the question was asked. "Mr. Valenti," she said, "if I needed your money, I wouldn't have had to drag you through 130 feet of snow. I could have simply stood still in that alley and made 1 telephone call. I imagine the people who left you out there would pay considerably more than $50,000 for this address." The room became so quiet they could hear the snow scraping against the window. The most powerful man in Chicago stared at his own maid for a very long time, and for the first time in an exchange, he was the one with no next move. At last he said, "Then what do you want?" "I want you to finish the soup." Colleen stood and smoothed her apron. "My mother made it. She never cooks for strangers. And you're going to need your strength, because this afternoon there are several things you need to see. Things connected to the ledger you kept talking about while you were feverish last night." She saw his shoulders stiffen beneath the blankets and watched the gray in his eyes darken by 2 shades. "What else did I say?" he asked, his voice dropping lower. "Enough to make me lock more doors and stay awake all night," she replied. Then she turned to leave, and at the exact moment her hand touched the doorknob, the telephone in the living room tore through the silence of the entire house. its ancient mechanical ring blaring like an alarm. She heard her mother lift the receiver, heard Helen say hello, then a pause longer than usual, and Helen's voice shifted into the guarded politeness she reserved for strangers. "Yes, she is. Let me get her." Colleen took the receiver, and the woman's voice at the other end, smooth as silk, made her spine straighten with the reflex drilled into her over 11 months. "Colleen, is that you, dear?" Verna Sloane, head housekeeper of the Valenti mansion, the woman who had stood in its grand hall for more than 20 years, who knew the schedule of every living shadow in the house, who had taught Colleen on her first day that a good servant was one no one ever noticed. "You took today off without permission," Verna said, her voice still soft, gentle, almost affectionate. "I've been terribly worried. In weather like this, and with you carrying a child, I came to see my mother because she's ill, Miss Sloane. All the roads were blocked, so I couldn't call in time." "Of course I understand," Verna said, and then her voice grew 1 degree sweeter. "So you're at your mother's house now? Read me the exact address, dear. I'll send a car to collect you. Our vehicles can handle the snow. We'll bring you back right now. No need to wait for the storm to pass." Some instinct kept Colleen from giving the address. She heard her own voice speak into the receiver, with an almost unnatural calm, telling Verna there was no need to trouble herself, that large cars couldn't get into her neighborhood because the alley was narrow and the snow had piled too high, that once the storm passed she would find her own way back. Then, to make the conversation sound natural, she asked exactly 2 questions about how things were going at the mansion, and hung up before Verna could sweeten her voice again. Colleen stood looking at the telephone for a moment. In 11 months of employment, the head housekeeper had never once called to ask whether she was sick, had never once remembered how many months pregnant she was, and yet today Verna Sloane seemed to need her exact address very badly. When Colleen returned to the bedroom, the man had managed to sit halfway up, his back braced against the wall, and from the way he looked at her, she knew he had heard everything. She asked for the address, he said, and it wasn't a question, and insisted on sending a car immediately. Colleen replied with a nod. His jaw tightened once. "Bring me the telephone. There's one number I know by heart, only one. The person who answers will ask me a question. If I answer correctly, we'll have 3 more men here this afternoon. If I get even one word wrong, you'll know someone has a gun pressed against the back of my neck." Colleen brought the telephone into the room, its cord stretched taut across the hallway, and she listened as he dialed from memory. The call was answered after half a ring without a greeting, and the exhausted man in the bed said something strange. "What's the weather like in Palermo?" The answer came through the receiver loudly enough for her to hear, a voice deep as rolling stone. "Who's asking?" Cesare replied, the man who once swore it was rain. There was exactly 1 second of silence. Then the deep voice said 3 words. "Give the address," and Colleen understood that somewhere across the city, a mountain had just risen to its feet. 40 minutes later, no convoy of black cars arrived like something out of a movie. A privately owned orange snowplow rumbled past and stopped at the end of the block as though the driver were taking a break between jobs. Then a rusted pickup carrying firewood parked 2 houses away. Finally, an old earth-brown Buick pulled up along the curb across the street, the kind of car no one in Bridgeport would bother looking at twice. 3 men entered through the kitchen door, one at a time, several minutes apart. The first had to turn his shoulders sideways to fit through the frame. He stood more than 6 feet 3 inches tall, with a chest as broad as a refrigerator door, and blonde hair clipped close to his scalp. The first thing the giant did when he saw Cesare sitting upright in bed was stop in the middle of the room for exactly 3 seconds. He said nothing. Only something in those stone-heavy shoulders seemed to loosen. Then he stepped forward, closed hands as large as shovels around his employer's hand, gave 1 firm squeeze and 1 nod, and that was all. 20 years of loyalty contained in 2 silent seconds. "Bruno," Cesare said. The second man was thin, with salt and pepper hair, and an oilcloth bag in one hand. He moved without making a sound, his eyes sweeping the room in the manner of someone who had worked in places where windows were things to be wary of. That was Doc Mercer. The third was very young and wore a laptop backpack. The moment he entered, his hip struck the small table in the living room and sent a porcelain angel tipping sideways. He caught it with both hands like a goalkeeper stopping a penalty shot, clutched it to his chest, and turned pale as he faced the lady of the house, who stood in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed. "I'm sorry," I swear I didn't mean to. It cost $4 at a flea market, Helen said in her dry, even voice. The bottom still says it was made overseas. Put it down and eat. The soup is hot. The young man called Static lowered the angel as carefully as if it were an egg, sat properly at the dining table, and within 10 minutes had finished 2 bowls of soup and 4 slices of bread. Meanwhile, the other 2 men perched with only half their weight on the edge of Helen's flowered sofa, cautious as men afraid they might break the furniture. 3 wolves had wandered into a dollhouse, and with the smell of chicken soup and the sound of a boiling kettle, that dollhouse was taming them faster than anything else could have. Doc didn't eat. He opened the oilcloth bag, went to the bed, and began working. A light in the pupils, a stethoscope, 2 fingers pressing along the rib cage until Cesare ground his teeth. Then he stopped at the line of stitches along the left side, bent close to study the 7 perfectly even sutures, and for the first time since entering the house, Doc Mercer turned fully around to find Colleen. "Who closed this wound? I did," Colleen said. "Who brought down the fever? Who rewarmed him? I did that too." Doc studied her for another moment. "How did you warm him?" he asked. She explained. "Warm water bottles wrapped in towels and placed beneath the arms and against the groin. 3 layers of blankets. Sugar water given 1 spoonful at a time. No direct heat, no rubbing the extremities." "Where did you learn that?" "Nursing school at the University of Illinois, Chicago," she said. "I left 6 weeks before the final examination." She said the word left the way someone might speak of the weather, but Doc Mercer had stood inside enough military medical tents to hear the true weight of words spoken lightly. He remained silent for a moment, the silence of a man grading an examination, then folded the stethoscope and returned it to his bag. When he spoke, his voice wasn't loud, but everyone in the house heard him. "You didn't leave before anything. When the body temperature drops that far, warming someone the wrong way can kill them while they're being brought back. It happens even in emergency rooms filled with equipment. Half the people carrying proper degrees still get the order wrong. This man is breathing because you did every step correctly." No one spoke. Static stopped chewing. Bruno slowly turned his head toward the pregnant woman in the wrinkled maid's uniform, standing beside the dish cabinet. And Colleen had to turn away and pour water, so no one would see her face in that moment, because it had been 3 years. 3 years since she packed her textbooks into a cardboard box, since anyone had told her who she was. Cesare Valenti watched everything from the bed, missing nothing, and when Colleen turned back, he looked at her as though he had been forced to recalculate an equation whose answer kept growing larger. Then he spoke to Bruno, his voice once again carrying the authority of the man in command. "Bring everyone in here. Close the door. There are several things I need to tell you about the last 3 days, and about a ledger that nearly had all of you dressing in black to attend my funeral." That evening, after Cesare finished recounting the past 3 days in his spare, restrained way, how he had spent 2 months tracing irregular figures in the port reports, how on the night he disappeared he had gone to meet a source and never reached the rendezvous, Colleen looked at her mother, and Helen nodded. It was time. She led the man, who still had to brace one hand against the wall as he walked, down into the basement, with Bruno following behind carrying a flashlight and Static clutching his laptop. And she watched the head of an empire stop dead between the rows of steel shelves, his eyes sweeping across hundreds of moss-green ledger spines aligned in perfect order. Across the white labels marked with months and years in that slanted handwriting, and she heard him say, so quietly it sounded as though he were speaking to himself, "I know this handwriting. It's in the old ledgers in my father's office. They told me the old accountant died in an accident. He was my father," Colleen said. "Arthur Whitlock." Cesare turned and looked at her for a long time, and something shifted into a new arrangement behind those gray eyes, like a chessboard being turned around. Then Helen handed him the tin box. He opened the lid, lifted the small sheet folded into quarters and worn along all 4 edges, read the single line, "Give this to the heir, only the heir," and Colleen witnessed something perhaps no one in Chicago had ever seen before. Cesare Valenti had to reach for the wooden stool behind him and sit down, slowly, as though that thin scrap of paper weighed more than the 3 days he had spent imprisoned. "A man whose face I can't even remember," he said after a while, his voice low, "died because of my family, and before he died, he still left me a thread to follow back to the man who killed him." No one answered. Static was given permission to open his laptop, And for the next 4 hours the basement became a room of comparison and verification. The photocopied ledger page marked with the red circle was placed beside the screen. Original volumes were pulled down year by year, and the layers of truth peeled away slowly, like bandages lifted from a wound. The entry her father had circled in red was a transfer from the pension fund of the Port Workers Union, a fund the Valenti family had managed in trust since Cesare's grandfather's time, as a matter of honor with the longshoreman who had stood by the family for 3 generations. Static typed, cross-checked, and read each discovery aloud in a voice that grew quieter with every new finding. It wasn't a single transfer. It had happened every quarter, steadily, for 9 years. Each withdrawal was small enough to slip through an audit, regular enough to become an underground river, all of it flowing through 3 intermediary companies before disappearing into an overseas account. "Add it up," Cesare said. Static did, stared at the number on the screen, then turned the laptop around. No one in the basement spoke for 10 seconds. 214 families, Bruno said, his voice grinding like stone. "I grew up in the Port District. I know every family name on that fund list. They still believe their retirement money is sitting there untouched." But the discovery that made Cesare spring to his feet and forget the stitches in his side lay elsewhere. Every withdrawal from the fund required written authorization from the head of the family, and Static uncovered a scanned copy of the original authorization stored in the system, a document dated 9 years earlier and bearing the signature of Aldo Valenti. Cesare studied the signature for a very long time. "It looks right," he said. "So right even I almost believe it." Then Colleen, who had stood silently beside the shelves from the beginning, stepped forward, bent over the scan, and said the sentence that made everyone in the basement turn toward her. "A signature can be copied perfectly, but ink doesn't know how to obey." She enlarged the page and pointed to the smooth, glossy black lines. "My father loved paper and ink the way other men love wine. He once made me sit through an entire afternoon listening to him explain this. This black gel ink, this particular sheen, this unbroken density, belongs to a product line that didn't reach the market until about 4 years after the date written on that document. That means this page was signed with a pen that didn't exist at the time it claims to have been signed." Static cross-checked it, his fingers striking the keys like a sewing machine, then looked up. "She's right. That ink line was released exactly 4 years after the date on the document. I've got the manufacturer's announcement right here. The authorization was backdated," Doc said slowly from the foot of the stairs, where he had stood guard for all 4 hours. "Which means the signature was forged after Don Aldo could no longer speak and deny it, and the only man with access to the seal, the archived documents, and the entire trust system for the fund," Cesare said, each word dropping onto the cold basement floor, "was the man my father trusted enough to make consigliere, the man who taught me how to ride a bicycle, my father's own younger brother, Uncle Carmine." The name whispered in fever the night before now stood in the basement, as though made of flesh and bone. Static swallowed. "There's more," he said, and opened a file taken from the family law firm's server, a draft contract already in the initial approval stage, selling the entire port, the warehouses, and the transportation routes, to a corporation called Obsidian Group. The signing date was set for the 17th, exactly 5 days away, and once ownership of the port changed hands, all old records would be consolidated, digitized again, and the originals destroyed under the transfer clause. 5 days from now, every trace disappears forever, Bruno said. The basement fell silent, and within that silence, Colleen studied the man standing amid 26 years of her father's records. She watched his hands close slowly into fists, saw his jaw tighten until the muscles stood out, saw in his eyes the kind of darkness she suspected had ended more than a few stories in that city, without any trial ever taking place. And before that darkness could become words, she asked, in the same calm tone someone might use to discuss the weather, the question her father had left for her without her knowing it. "Mr. Valenti, your uncle is loyal to money, your men are loyal to you, but what are you loyal to?" Cesare didn't answer that question that night, and Colleen didn't press him for an answer. Some questions weren't asked to be answered at once, but to remain inside the listener's chest, and she had learned that from her father. On the third morning beneath the same roof, the snow had weakened into sparse flurries of white dust, and Helen's kitchen had become an improvised command post. Static occupied half the dining table with 2 laptops open side by side. charging cords stretched across the sugar jar. Bruno stood by the window with a tiny cup of coffee nearly disappearing inside his hand, and Doc changed the dressing over the wound, before declaring that Colleen's stitches were so beautiful he had nothing left to do. By the middle of the morning, Static found something that brought the entire kitchen to a halt. He had been tracing the 3 intermediary companies since the night before, peeling away each layer, and one of those 3 shells, a front company registered under Carmine's control, contained an expense that didn't belong to the 9-year stream of money, a separate payment, recent and very close. $38,000, Static read aloud, transferred for security consulting services. The recipient is a private security firm owned by Ray Dutton. The name landed on the dining table, and Bruno slowly set down his coffee cup. Dutton, he said, former Chicago police officer, thrown off the force a few years ago for beating a man during an interrogation. Now he sells his services to people who need dirty work done cleanly. I know his face, date of transfer? Cesare asked from the armchair. Static looked at the screen, then at his employer. Exactly 3 days before the night you disappeared. No one needed to draw the rest of the picture. Money paid first, the man vanished afterward. The invoice for a killing settled through a shell account controlled by the victim's own uncle. Cesare remained silent for a long time. Then, for the first time, he told the whole story in the flat, economical voice of a man who didn't allow memory to perform. That night, he had driven alone to meet a source at the old port. Before he reached the meeting place, 2 unmarked vehicles blocked the road. He woke in a dark warehouse with his hands tied to a steel chair, and for 3 days the masked men asked him only one thing, though they asked it in many different ways. Where was the ledger? Who had the original? Who had he told? They were professionals, he said. Professional enough that I understood they had orders to keep me breathing until I answered, and I also understood what would come after I did. On the 3rd night, the temperature plunged, the warehouse heater overloaded, and the power shorted out. In the darkness and the shriek of the fire alarm, he did the only thing left to him. He tipped the chair sideways, broke the restraint, and ran. A bullet chased him through the container yard and grazed his left side. He kept dragging himself toward the low roofs of Bridgeport through the storm because it was the opposite direction from anywhere they expected him to go. No hotel, no hospital, no familiar face. That warehouse is on the edge of this neighborhood, Bruno said quietly. Less than 1.25 miles from the alley behind this house. I remember following the fence of a churchyard, Cesare said. After that, everything was white. After that came the smell of chicken soup. He said no more, and no one asked. There were some stretches of 3 days in a person's life that others only needed to know existed, without ever looking inside them. Static broke the silence with his second discovery. The night before, he had asked Cesare's permission to get inside the Valenti mansion's own telephone exchange, and now the call log appeared on the screen in neat columns. Yesterday's call to this house, he said, turning the laptop around, came from the head housekeeper's extension at 11:26 in the morning and lasted 4 minutes. But this is the part that matters. Less than 2 minutes after that call ended, the same extension placed an outside call to a prepaid cell phone. I checked the number. During the past month, that prepaid phone contacted Dutton's security office more than 12 times. Verna Sloan. Colleen heard the woman's name in her head in the same silken voice from the day before. Read me the exact address, dear. A chill traveled down her spine as she understood that the kindly telephone call had really been a probe sent out to locate coordinates. More than 20 years standing in the great hall of your house, Bruno said, his voice heavy as lead. She knows when every person sleeps. She even knows where you hid candy when you were a boy. Wait, Cesare said, raising one hand. No one touches her. A piece that has been exposed while the opponent doesn't know it has been exposed is worth more than 10 pieces still concealed. Let her continue reporting exactly what we want her to see. He spoke with the calm voice of a chess player, but Colleen stood close enough to see his knuckles whitening against the arm of the chair. Then, while the kitchen was still silent beneath the weight of those 2 discoveries, Helen, who had been watering the potted plants by the living room window without once turning around, suddenly spoke in the same even tone she might have used to comment on the weather. I don't mean to interrupt your work, gentlemen, but a gray sedan has been parked at the end of the street since 10:30. The engine is off. No one has gotten out. The person in the driver's seat hasn't changed position once, and before every neck in the kitchen could finish turning toward her, she shifted the watering can to the next pot and added, "I'm old, not blind. You boys should look through the curtain gap, don't pull it back." The gray sedan was still there when the sun reached its highest point, patient as a cat waiting outside a burrow, and the entire house learned how to live around its presence, moving out of sight of the windows, lowering every conversation by half a tone, while Static continued digging through the mansion's systems under Cesare's orders, searching for whatever else Verna Sloan had sent outside through the extension in the housekeeper's office. And it was while tracing the traitor's trail that he stumbled upon something entirely different. "Wait," Static said, his hands freezing above the keyboard. "This is strange." He was inside the mansion's digitized personnel archive, and the file bearing the name Colleen Whitlock was thicker than that of any other servant, because attached to her application and contract was a scanned copy of an older document, a handwritten letter on personal stationery, the kind of paper whose edges had yellowed even in the scan. The signature beneath it belonged to Aldo Valenti. Cesare rose from the armchair so quickly that Doc had to remind him about the stitches. "Read it," he said, then changed his mind in the same breath. "No, print it. This isn't something to read on a screen." Helen's old printer in the corner of the living room groaned and pushed out a single sheet, and Cesare held it in both hands, read it once in silence, then did something no one expected. He crossed the kitchen, stopped in front of Colleen, who was standing beside the sink, and handed the page to her. "It belongs to you," he said. "Not to me." Colleen wiped her hands on her apron before taking it, a habit formed over 11 months, and began to read. The letter was dated around the time of her father's passing and addressed to the family's head of personnel. The handwriting shook more than her father's had, but every line remained straight, the writing of an old man who was ill and refused to let anyone know. "Take this girl on," the letter said. "Give her light work and enough pay to support her elderly mother. Don't tell her who arranged it, and don't allow anyone in the house to make her life difficult." Then came the final line, the line Colleen would remember, comma by comma, for the rest of her life. "She is Arthur's daughter, the man who kept my books for 26 years and never made a mistake in a single line. I owe him a debt I could spend my entire life trying to repay. At the very least, let me repay part of it this way. Signed, Aldo Valenti, 1 month before his death." The kitchen fell completely silent. Colleen read the letter a second time, more slowly, and halfway through, the paper began to tremble in her hands. For 11 months, she had believed she had entered that mansion because of a job notice posted at the laundromat, because of the accidental good fortune of someone desperate. For 11 months, she had lowered her head and scrubbed those endless corridors, learning not to look anyone in the eye, learning how to become a shadow, believing that inside that stone house no one knew who she was and no one cared to know. Yet before her first day had even begun, an old man dying from illness had sat down and written a letter by hand to make certain that the daughter of his longtime accountant had work, had enough wages to feed her mother, and wouldn't be mistreated. A man she had never met, a man who had protected her from beyond the grave, in the same way her own father was guiding all of them from beyond the grave. The tears came without warning, without sobs, without any effort to hold them back, only 2 silent streams slipping down her face, while she remained standing straight, holding the page carefully in both hands as though it were something sacred. And suddenly the kitchen, full of men accustomed to guns and violence, had no idea where to put their hands. Bruno lowered his eyes to his coffee cup. Static pretended to be occupied with the screen. Doc silently slid the box of tissues across the table toward her and said nothing. Helen came to her daughter's side and didn't embrace her. She simply rested one hand in the center of Colleen's back, and mother and daughter stood that way for a long time in the rare sunlight filtering through the narrow opening in the curtain. Cesare Valenti remained in the kitchen doorway, watching a maid from his household cry because of his father's kindness, and across the face that had never betrayed anything, something began to crack, slowly, like the first ice of winter. "You know," he said, his voice quieter than usual, "all my life, every letter I read from him contained an order. This is the first one I've ever seen where he asked for something. He said nothing more, and no one asked him to." Afternoon faded into evening. The gray sedan left at dusk as though changing shifts. Dinner passed beneath a silence that had grown less heavy, and later that night, As Colleen walked past the kitchen on her way upstairs, she stopped because she heard a sound that didn't belong to the usual rhythm of the house. Running water and the faint touch of porcelain against porcelain. She looked through the narrow opening in the doorway. Cesare Valenti stood at the sink beneath the yellow light, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows, one hand pressed lightly against the stitches in his side, while the other rinsed each dinner bowl beneath the warm faucet, slowly, awkwardly, with excessive care, like a man doing something for the first time in his life. He placed each bowl on the rack in order from largest to smallest, exactly the way he must have observed her arranging them. No one had asked him. No one was watching him, or at least he believed no one was. Colleen remained in the dark hallway for 10 more seconds, then stepped back and climbed the stairs without making a sound, leaving the most powerful man in Chicago to finish washing the dishes in a Bridgeport kitchen, while across the city, unknown to any of them, an old name was being typed into Static's computer, a name that was about to bring the ceiling crashing down over Colleen's head all over again. The name appeared while Static was doing something that should have been nothing more than routine. He was reviewing the entire internal cash disbursement ledger of Dutton's security firm, data he had just recovered from a cloud storage server the company believed it had erased, compiling a list of everyone who had ever taken work from Dutton in case they had to face any of them in the days ahead. The list ran long, aliases, initials, payments ranging from a few $100s to several thousand, and then, in the section from the period leading up to her father's death, one line stopped Static's finger on the scroll wheel. He read it again, cross-checked it against the mansion's personnel records he had searched that afternoon. Then he sat very still, the kind of stillness everyone noticed immediately inside a small house. "What is it?" Bruno asked. "Nothing," Static said, far too quickly. Cesare set down his teacup. "Read the screen," he said, his voice not loud, but leaving no room for the word no. Static looked at Colleen, then at his employer, then back at Colleen, and the movement of his eyes told half the story before he spoke. She sat in the chair across from him and placed both hands on the table. "Read it, Static," she said. "I've heard bad news in this house for 2 days straight. I'm used to it." The young man drew a breath. "In Dutton's payment ledger, dating back to the time of the accident, there's a subcontract," he began slowly. "The assignment is written in code, but it isn't difficult to decipher. Approach a female target. Verify where the deceased subject's accounting documents are being kept. The deceased subject is identified by the initials AW. The kitchen seemed to grow 1 degree colder. The contractor received $5,000 in advance." Static continued, and right before Arthur was targeted, he began appearing regularly in the weekly reports. Contact established with Target. Relationship created. Trust developing. Target has no knowledge of her father's former work. Static stopped again, and Cesare said quietly, "The name." "The final payment was made shortly after the funeral," Static said. $20,000 in cash, with a note marking the contract complete. 1 page photographed from an original document. Subject believed to possess the remaining records at an unknown location. Recommend termination due to exposure risk. The man who signed for the money was Troy Ackman. No one breathed for 3 seconds. Colleen sat motionless, both hands still resting on the table, while that entire deceptive relationship rearranged itself inside her mind like a film running backward. The cheerful man she had met at the laundromat, the one who insisted on giving her the coin for the dryer, the cheap but warm little dates, the way he so often asked about her father with the concern of a lover who wanted to understand the deepest root of his girlfriend's grief. The time he asked to visit Helen and then wandered through the house, studying the bookshelves and the memorial photograph. In the afternoon she found him holding her mother's Bible, smiling as he said he was only curious about what branch of the faith her family had come from. The photocopied page her father had hidden inside that Bible, the page Helen guarded like a portrait of the dead. Troy had photographed it in this very living room. Then, 2 months later, he disappeared, at the same time as the $32,000 loan taken out in Colleen's name, the loan he had begged her to sign for the business they were supposedly going to build together, leaving her with a newly forming child and a stack of collection notices. It turned out even his disappearance had an invoice. Even this baby, Colleen thought, and her hand moved down to rest over her stomach, had been entered as a line in someone else's expenses. Everyone in the kitchen watched her, waiting for her to break, for tears, for a fist against the table, for anything a person was supposed to do upon discovering that an entire chapter of her life had been nothing more than an enemy's contract. But Colleen Whitlock only straightened her back, slowly, vertebra by vertebra, like a flag being raised, and when she spoke, not a single word in her voice fractured. "Then it's clear," she said. "They knew my father kept records before you did. They were searching for this house before you were taken. The page Troy photographed was what convinced them the originals existed. Which means everything that happened to you," she looked at Cesare, began, in part, inside my living room. She stood, crossed to the stove, and set the kettle on as though her body needed a task while her soul put its belongings back in order. Then she turned toward all of them, toward the men who didn't know where to hide the pity in their eyes, and said the sentence Static would later describe as the moment he stopped thinking of her as a civilian. "This child was conceived through a lie," Colleen said, every word clear, "but it will be born into the truth. I'll take care of that. Right now, no one in this kitchen is going to pity me. It's written all over your faces. Put it away and get back to work." No one spoke. Doc gave one very slow nod, the kind of nod a soldier gave another soldier. Bruno, the bear of a man who weighed well over 200 pounds, suddenly set down his coffee cup, muttered something about checking the perimeter, and stepped onto the back porch, where he stood alone for exactly 5 minutes in the skin, cutting cold. When he came back inside, his eyes were red, and everyone in the house silently agreed to blame the wind. At that exact moment, Static's laptop gave 3 short beeps, an alert from the program he had installed to monitor Dutton's deployment schedule. He bent toward the screen and read, his face changing color for the second time that evening. "Dutton just called in more men," he said. 6 of them, fully equipped. "They've been ordered to assemble tonight, and the deployment point is marked 3 blocks from here." Cesare rose from his chair, and this time no one reminded him about the stitches. "They aren't waiting until the 17th anymore," he said. Those words revealed a Cesare the little house had never seen before. The man who had spent 3 days sitting at the table eating soup and washing dishes vanished in a blink, and the figure who rose in the middle of the kitchen was the ruler of Chicago. His voice dropped an octave, and his orders came in short bursts like rounds being chambered. "Bruno, call in 4 more men we can trust and position them around the neighborhood. Static, pull every location record on Dutton's team. Doc, check the medical bag. As for me," he said, and in his eyes was the darkness Colleen had glimpsed in the basement the night before, "I need an address. My uncle's private residence. This ends tonight the Valenti way. No witnesses, no trial. No need to wait for the 17th. Bruno already had the telephone in his hand. Doc had already pulled the zipper on his bag. The entire enormous machine had begun turning under the momentum of 20 years, and the only person willing to step between its gears was the pregnant woman standing beside the boiling kettle. "And then what?" Colleen asked. Cesare turned toward her. "What do you mean, then what?" She poured boiling water into the teapot, her hand perfectly steady. "Let's assume you succeed," she said. "Tonight your uncle disappears. Cleanly, quietly, Valenti way. Then tomorrow morning, 214 families in the Port District wake up, and there still isn't a single dollar in their retirement fund, because the money is sitting in foreign accounts that only a federal order can freeze and recover. The Obsidian contract is still there, with every preliminary signature in place. Their lawyers will find someone else to finish it, and you become exactly what your uncle needs you to become, so all the blame has somewhere to fall, the nephew who murdered his uncle to seize power." "This is family business," Cesare said, his voice sharpening. "You don't understand how this world works. In my world, if a traitor is still breathing, you stop breathing. My father taught me that. My grandfather taught me that, did they?" Colleen set down the teapot. "Then listen to me, Mr. Valenti. Your uncle grew up with that same lesson. He has spoken that language more fluently than you for 30 years, and as long as you answer him in that language, you're still only his nephew, playing the game he set up on his board. By his rules." She took 1 step toward him, and none of the men in the kitchen dared breathe too loudly. "My father didn't leave behind a gun," she said. "He left paper, 26 years of paper, because he believed paper outlived people and spoke louder than bullets. If you want to repay what you owe my father and yours, then use the weapon those 2 old men left behind. But if what you want is revenge for your wounded pride, then the guns are right there. Go. Just don't call it justice, and don't do it with evidence taken from the basement of my house. The silence lasted 10 seconds and felt as long as a winter. Cesar stared at her, his jaw clenched, both fists tightening and releasing, tightening and releasing. The true battle of that night wasn't taking place outside in the street. It was happening inside a man being forced to choose between the person he had been raised to become and the person he might still become, and no one could help him make that choice, not even her. At last he turned to Static, his voice still rough but changing direction like a great ship altering course. 214 families, he said. If we take this federal, can the money truly be recovered? Static began typing rapidly. Fraud involving a trust fund this size will almost certainly trigger an emergency asset freeze, he said. Freeze first, prosecute afterward. If the money hasn't moved yet, it gets locked down. There's precedent. Cesare gave one slow nod, as though signing an invisible document. Then we do it, the Whitlock way, he said, and Colleen had to turn away to hide the breath that escaped her. The plan took shape within an hour. Copies were made of everything: the original ledger page, the authorization written with ink from the wrong era, the 9-year flow of money, the $38,000 payment to Dutton, the Obsidian contract file. All of it was assembled into 2 complete sets. One would go to Dana Kessler, the investigative reporter at the Tribune, whose own father had worked as a longshoreman and had once lost his entire pension because he trusted the wrong people. Static said she had been digging into the Valenti family for years and had always lacked this one central piece. The second set would be sealed and sent to Inspector Ed Lawson in organized crime, a man Bruno described as still clean, only tired. When do we send them? Bruno asked. Not yet, Cesare said. Sending them 1 hour too early means warning the snake 1 hour too early. We need them to come here with their hands dirty. Static watched Dutton's team minute by minute, late that night, when everyone in the house was moving into position, and Colleen carried a stack of blankets onto the back porch. To leave with the neighbor as part of a safety plan. She herself agreed was sensible. She found Cesare standing alone in the darkness, looking out over the snow-covered alley. At the sound of the door, he turned, saw her shivering with the blankets in her arms, and without saying anything stepped toward her, set the stack on the porch rail, then fastened the top button of the coat she had left undone. The gesture was slow and awkward, like the way he had washed dishes that night, and his fingers lingered at her collar for exactly 1 second longer than necessary. Colleen stepped back half a pace, no more than enough. Don't, she said, not angrily, only plainly. I'm grateful for many things you've done these past 3 days, but I'm not the next chapter in the list of things you own. Cesare lowered his hand, and in the darkness of the back porch, she heard him speak in the voice of a man reading aloud for the first time a sentence he had never dared write. I know, he said. You're the first chapter in the list of things I don't deserve. Then he lifted the blankets, placed them back in her arms, and went inside ahead of her, leaving the woman standing alone in the white cloud of her own breath, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit, while at the far end of the street, the gray sedan had returned without anyone noticing, its lights off, silent and patient, waiting for the night to deepen. Colleen went to stay with their neighbor, Mrs. Kowalczyk, just after nightfall, carrying the stack of blankets, her mother's heart medication as a precaution, and a simple explanation that there was a problem with the plumbing at home. The 80-year-old Polish woman, who had cared for mother and daughter since Arthur was alive, asked only one question, whether Colleen had eaten dinner, then went to turn on the living room heater. Colleen sat in the chair beside the window, one hand resting on her stomach, her eyes fixed on the narrow gap in the curtains facing her mother's house, 4 doors away, without the slightest intention of demanding to return. She was a nurse. She understood better than anyone that inside that house tonight, a woman 5 months pregnant wasn't a fighter but a burden, and the hardest thing she could do for all of them was remain seated where she was, breathe evenly, and keep the baby sleeping peacefully. Helen, however, refused to leave. The argument lasted less time than anyone expected. Bruno tried, Doc tried, Cesare himself tried, using the voice that had persuaded the most stubborn men in Chicago to change their minds. The 68-year-old woman listened to all of them, nodded thoughtfully, then said, Are you boys finished? This is my house. My husband died 3 years ago, and I wasn't beside him when it happened. My daughter nearly froze to death in that alley 2 nights ago, and now you're telling me to pack a bag and sleep in someone else's home so I can make room for guests who have come here to fight. I'm better at making tea than I am at running, and if anyone asks, an old woman sitting in her own living room drinking tea at midnight is the most lawful thing in the world. Then she went upstairs to put on her finest cardigan as though preparing to receive company. No one could argue with that logic, and after studying her for 3 seconds, Cesare said only one thing to Bruno. Wherever she sits, give her 3 layers. The house settled into readiness like a body holding its breath. Static established himself in the corner of the dining room, hidden from every window, with 2 screens divided into 6 blue-gray squares showing images from security cameras belonging to several homes along the street. Cameras he had temporarily borrowed without asking permission. The beginning of the block, the far end, the alley, the porches. He sat with his feet drawn up onto the chair, clicking a ballpoint pen until Bruno turned his head and gave him one look, and the clicking stopped at once. Doc chose the small table beside the hallway entrance, spread a clean cloth over it, and laid out not weapons but an open medical bag, bandage scissors, gauze, clamps, each item wiped again with alcohol in a sequence he had repeated 1,000 times in distant places. His movements were so slow and steady that anyone watching could feel their own heartbeat begin to settle into the same rhythm. The 4 additional men Bruno had called in had disappeared into the neighborhood before full darkness. One waited inside the pickup carrying firewood. Another occupied the ground floor of the house across the street, rented for 3 $100 bills and a promise. The remaining 2 held positions that even Static needed several moments of searching through the camera feeds to identify. Bruno, the bear of a man, took his place beside the large living room window, exactly 1 body width beyond the line of sight from outside, and stood there in absolute stillness, neither leaning against the wall nor shifting his weight from one foot to the other, a stone carved into the shape of a man in the darkness. Only the occasional long rise and fall of his massive chest revealed that the stone was alive. Cesare sat in Arthur's armchair, in the deepest shadow of the living room, the stitches in his side tightly reinforced by Doc, and did nothing at all. He didn't pace, he didn't ask questions. He simply sat with both hands clasped before his chin, his eyes open in the darkness, a spider at the center of its web waiting for the first thread to tremble. At 11 o'clock, Helen made the first pot of tea and poured a cup for each of them. No one refused. Shortly before midnight, Static whispered that the snow had stopped, and when everyone listened, they realized the faint scraping of snow against the windows had vanished without anyone noticing. The world outside had fallen into a new silence, hard and clear as glass, the silence of the deepest winter nights, when the entire city froze so completely that sound seemed to have nothing left to cling to. Within that silence, the house could hear itself, the crack of old wood contracting somewhere upstairs, the low hum of the refrigerator before it fell quiet, the ticking of Arthur's old pendulum clock above the fireplace, counting every second, tick-tock, patient as a heart that had never learned fear. At 12:20, the upper left square on Static's screen shifted. The gray sedan started, its lights still off, rolled slowly away from the end of the street, and disappeared from the camera's view. "It's gone," Static whispered, but no one in the room felt relief. Instead, Bruno and Cesare exchanged a look through the darkness that required no translation. The scout pulling away meant the report had been delivered. It meant a decision had been made somewhere. It meant all that remained was to wait. At 1 o'clock, Helen poured the second pot of tea without spilling a single drop. At 1:30, Static began counting his own breaths to stay awake and lost track at the 40th. At 1:45, the pendulum clock gave a single faint chime, soft as a spoon touching porcelain, and immediately after the sound faded, Static's earpiece crackled. Bruno's man on the ground floor across the street pressed the radio twice in short succession, the agreed signal. Headlights had just gone dark 2 blocks away. More than one vehicle, no one spoke. Bruno slowly rolled his neck, the joints cracking in the silence. Doc folded the cloth over his instruments. Helen placed her teacup neatly onto its saucer and straightened her back in the rocking chair. Cesare Valenti opened his eyes. Arthur Whitlock's pendulum clock read 1:47 in the morning. At 5 minutes to 2, figures separated from the darkness at the far end of the street, and on Static's screen they appeared like stains of ink spreading across the gray snow, 7 shapes in all. 6 divided into teams of 2. The first pair moved along the row of fences on the left. The second circled toward the alley behind the house. The third crossed diagonally over the white street. The seventh figure followed at a slower pace, both hands tucked into his coat pockets, walking with the easy stride of a man accustomed to giving orders rather than carrying them out. Bruno glanced over Static's shoulder for exactly 1 second and said quietly, "Dutton." He came himself. "He wants to close this file with his own hands." Cesare, still seated in Arthur's armchair, asked only one question. "Static, have the 2 files gone out?" The young man struck the keys one final time, then looked up. "They're gone, sir, exactly as you ordered. Both Kessler's inbox and Inspector Lawson's inbox received them. The server confirmed delivery 43 minutes ago, along with the location records showing the gray sedan parked outside this house for 2 days." Cesare nodded, rose from the chair, adjusted the collar of his shirt like a man preparing to attend a meeting, and disappeared through the kitchen door toward the corner of the back porch, taking the position assigned to him. Outside, the first pair had reached the front path, their boots compressing the snow with a soft crunch at every step. They approached the porch. One man bent to examine the front door lock while the other stood guard, and at the exact moment the gloved hand touched the doorknob, the porch light came on. There was no alarm and no shouted warning, only a circle of yellow light falling over the 2 men on the steps, like a stage lamp blazing to life in the middle of a clumsy play. And while they were still blinded, the front door opened from within, quietly and without haste. The entire doorway was filled by something the human mind needed a full second to accept as real. Bruno stood there with his shoulders touching both sides of the frame, and his head nearly brushing the top, silently looking down at them. Behind that mountainous shoulder, deep in the hallway, the men outside could see Doc Mercer standing motionless, with both hands hanging loosely at his sides. And farther beyond him, in the warm pool of living room light, an old woman with silver hair sat in a rocking chair, lifting a cup of tea to her lips and blowing gently across it, as though 2 o'clock in the morning were the most civilized hour in the world for tea. Static would later swear that it was this image that broke the spine of the fight before it began, because no plan made by men who worked at night had room for an unsurprised old woman drinking tea. Her lack of surprise meant they had been expected. Being expected meant they had walked into a trap. Everything else happened within 90 seconds, and almost without sound. The man nearest the door had barely raised his hand before finding his wrist enclosed inside Bruno's enormous grip. One twist, one pull, and he landed face down in the deep snow covering the flower bed, with someone's knee pressing between his shoulder blades. The second man managed half a step backward, before discovering that 2 of Bruno's men had somehow appeared behind him from opposite sides of the porch. The pair circling through the back alley encountered Doc and the 4th man waiting in the exact place they intended to climb over, and learned that having one's shoulder joint locked by a former military medic hurt just as much as when anyone else did it, though it was considerably more polite. The final pair crossing the street hadn't even reached the sidewalk when they stopped dead as the headlights of the firewood pickup snapped on directly in their faces, and in the windless night, the click of a vehicle door opening behind them sounded perfectly clear. Not one gunshot, not one drop of blood on the snow. Only 6 men seated in a neat row along the porch steps and the flower bed, their hands bound behind them with the very plastic ties they had brought, their breath billowing in thick white clouds. Ray Dutton stopped halfway up the path, exactly where the darkness met the porch light. Smart enough not to take another step, he was measuring his escape routes when a voice came from the right corner of the porch, as calm as though greeting a familiar visitor. "Hello, Ray." Cesare Valenti stepped into the light. Dutton stood perfectly still. The man he had believed dead for 3 days was standing on the porch, alive, clean-shaven, his shirt pressed smooth, and that meant every report Dutton had submitted during the past 72 hours was worthless paper. "You came for the documents," Cesare said without raising his voice. "I'll save you some time. They're no longer here. They've been sitting in the inbox of the Tribune and the Organized Crime Unit for 43 minutes. Everything is there. The original ledger page, the forged authorization, the 9-year money trail, even the order transferring $38,000 from my uncle's shell company to your firm 3 days before I disappeared. Your accountant does very careful work, Ray. More careful work than you deserve." Dutton said nothing, and Cesare stepped down one porch stair, only one, enough for the 2 men to look directly into each other's eyes across the white yard. "It's 2 o'clock in the morning," he said. The story goes live at 6. That gives you 4 hours. 4 hours to decide what role you're going to play in this story. Defendant or witness who calls the prosecutor's office first. They treat those two kinds of men very differently. You used to be a police officer. You know that better than I do. The porch light gave a faint click in the cold. Ray Dutton. A man accustomed for 15 years to being the most dangerous person in every room he entered, looked at his 6 men sitting in a row on the snow, looked at the silent mountain filling the doorway, looked at the old woman still drinking tea through the illuminated window, then looked at the man who should have been a corpse beneath the ice somewhere near the port, and made the fastest, most accurate calculation of his life. He turned away. No words. No glance over his shoulder. Only the sound of his boots compressing the snow, growing fainter along the silent street. And a short while later, from the darkness at the far end of the block, the gray sedan's engine started and faded into the night, leaving 6 men seated on the steps of the Whitlock house and one question suspended in the frozen air. Would he use those 4 hours to run or to pick up the telephone? At 3 o'clock in the morning, the house settled back into its old rhythm. The 6 uninvited guests had been escorted out of the neighborhood by Bruno's men and taken to an address Cesare described only as a place where they would be kept warm and quiet until 6. 2 men remained outside to guard the perimeter. Doc conducted one final examination and declared that Cesare's stitches were still intact, despite the fact that their owner had moved around far more than prescribed. And Helen, instead of going to bed as everyone advised, put on the 3rd kettle of the night, explaining that adrenaline was something no one should take to bed with them, that it had to be diluted with tea. And so, at 3 in the morning, the little living room in Bridgeport witnessed a scene none of Static's security cameras recorded, though he would tell the story again and again for years afterward. A mafia boss sat on a flowered sofa holding a cup of chamomile tea. A former military medic sat carefully repacking his medical bag as neatly as one might fold an umbrella. A giant of a man occupied 2/3 of the couch and held a porcelain cup between 2 fingers for fear of breaking it, and a young man of 24 sat cross-legged on the rug, both hands wrapped around his tea, his eyes still shining with excitement that hadn't yet drained away. He was the one who broke the silence. "I'm asking honestly, so please don't laugh," Static said, turning toward the lady of the house as she rocked gently in her chair. "When those men reached the porch, I was sitting behind 2 screens, with 4 walls and Bruno standing between me and them like a steel safe, and my heart was still pounding all the way up in my throat. But you were sitting right beside the window, drinking tea, actually blowing on it. Weren't you afraid at all?" Helen took a sip, set the cup back onto its saucer, and considered the question seriously, tilting her head slightly to one side, as though it deserved a proper answer rather than some polite display of modesty. "Let me tell you something," she said. "When I was 24, the same age you are now, I worked the night shift as a nurse in the burn unit at Cook County Hospital. Back then there were no monitors beeping beside every bed, no automatic medication pumps, nothing except a wristwatch, a notebook, and 2 hands. 30 beds per shift, and I was alone. The people lying there suffered pain no healthy person's voice could imitate, and we weren't allowed to give them too much medicine. We could give only the proper dose at the proper time. So all night long, I walked between those 30 beds, one round after another, changing dressings, giving drops of water, recording everything, and talking. I talked about anything at all, the weather, the baseball team, an apple pie recipe, so they would have a human voice to hold on to until the next dose came. I worked in that room for 6 years. The living room became completely silent. Even the clicking of Static's pen had stopped long before. After those 6 years, Helen continued, her voice still as even as though she were reciting a stew recipe. I thought I had seen everything life could place in front of a person. Then, 3 years ago, someone called and told me my husband had fallen down a staircase, and I spent 5 weeks beside his bed in intensive care. 5 weeks listening to a ventilator count his breaths for him. During those 5 weeks, I had more than enough time to think. I thought about a man who had climbed the stairs in this house for 30 years, with both arms full of ledgers, and had never once missed a step. I thought about the parking garage with no camera, and the case that was closed after 11 days, pressed smooth and tidy as though someone had taken an iron to it. She lowered her eyes to the tea and turned the cup halfway around on its saucer. I buried my husband because of one word, Accident, and I never believed it for a single day, young man. Not one day in 3 years. But I had nothing in my hands except a wife's instinct. An instinct isn't something you can carry into a police station as evidence. So I locked it in the basement with his ledgers and waited. I didn't know what I was waiting for until the night my daughter dragged a strange man through the kitchen door. She raised her head, and there were no tears in the eyes of that 68-year-old woman. Only a dry, enduring light like coal. So when you ask whether I was afraid, this is my answer. After 30 beds in a burn unit, 5 weeks in intensive care, and 3 years of living with a question no one would help me answer, 6 clumsy men stumbling around in the snow outside my front door are, truthfully, the sort of thing that can be handled. Most things in this world can be handled. Static stared at her in stunned silence for several seconds. Then, as always, his mouth moved faster than his mind. Holy sh! Watch your language, Helen cut in without even turning her head. The young man swallowed the rest of the word along with a mouthful of tea, choked, coughed, and the entire room burst into laughter, even Doc, whom Bruno swore no one had seen laugh in 10 years. Cesare didn't laugh. He was watching the woman in the rocking chair with an expression difficult to name, the expression of a man who had just understood that he wasn't the only person in that room, who had waited 3 years to collect a debt. He set down his cup and spoke quietly. Mom, tomorrow morning, when all of this breaks open, your husband's death will no longer remain outside the case. I promise you that. Helen studied him for a moment, gave one small nod, then said, finish your tea, and then everyone returned to their places and get a little sleep. Tomorrow morning, you'll need clear heads more than promises, and no one in that room knew that several miles away, in a darkened apartment, Ray Dutton was sitting before a telephone in the middle of a table. It was 3:17 in the morning. He had 2 hours and 43 minutes left, and he still hadn't decided whom to call. The house drifted into a few brief hours of sleep. Static slumped in his chair with his laptop still open. Bruno slept sitting upright like a statue that knew how to snore softly, and the eastern sky began to change from black to the steel blue of dawn after a storm. The first light in 4 days that hadn't been filtered through a curtain of snow, so sharp that every edge of the world seemed newly honed. Cesare Valenti woke before everyone else, or perhaps he had never slept at all. He stood for a while beside the kitchen window, looking out at the narrow alley behind the row of houses, where the snow had stopped falling but still rose above the knee, burying the walkway and pushing several garbage cans crooked, and halfway down that alley, beside the brick wall, there was one place where his eyes lingered longer than anywhere else, a place that looked no different from every other yard of snow, except that he knew exactly what it was. Then he put on the thickest coat he could find on the Whitlock's coat rack, Arthur's old coat, the one Helen had never given away, pulled on gloves, opened the kitchen door quietly so he wouldn't wake anyone, and took the snow shovel standing in the corner of the porch. For a healthy man, it should have been 10 minutes of work. For a man with 7 stitches in his left side and 3 days of hell behind him, it became the labor of an entire dawn. He lifted one small shovelful at a time, slowly, leaning in a way that kept the strain off his left side, exactly as Doc had instructed, though Cesare had never once appeared to be listening. His breath rose in steady pillars of white smoke through air that cut like a razor, and the alley slowly emerged beneath the blade of the shovel, yard after yard, revealing the old cracked concrete path that no one had bothered clearing beyond the halfway point in perhaps 20 years. He shoveled past the place beside the brick wall, neither faster nor slower than anywhere else, but when the shovel touched concrete at that exact spot, he paused for one beat and looked down at the exposed ground, gray, ordinary, and nameless as every patch of concrete in the world, then continued. He set each garbage can upright and arranged them in a straight line against the wall, with a degree of order the neighborhood had never known, gathered the branches, broken by the storm, into a neat bundle, and finally found the bag of rock salt stored in the corner of the back porch, the kind every home in Chicago kept through winter. He walked the length of the alley one last time, scattering the salt by the handful across the path he had cleared, moving like a man sowing something into the earth, carefully and evenly so that no one at all, would ever slip and fall along that stretch again. Colleen returned home at that exact moment. She crossed over from Mrs. Kowalczyk's house as soon as the morning grew light enough. after spending nearly the entire night awake beside the narrow curtain gap in another person's home. She had been told briefly over the telephone that everything was all right, that no one had been hurt. But it wasn't until she entered the kitchen, set down her bag, and looked through the window above the sink that she stopped completely still. Outside, beneath the steel blue light of dawn, the most powerful man in Chicago was bending down to scatter salt across an alley in Bridgeport, her father's old coat hanging too loosely from his shoulders, his breath turning white in the air, every movement slow and careful with pain, while the alley behind him looked so clean, straight, and orderly that it seemed to belong to another neighborhood, another city, another life. She watched him for a long time, one hand still resting on the strap of her bag, and she didn't call for her mother or wake anyone else. Whatever was happening outside didn't seem meant to have an audience. Then she opened the kitchen door and stepped onto the porch, for no reason she could clearly name. Perhaps the kettle needed water. Perhaps her feet simply carried her there. Cesare heard the door and looked up. When he saw her, he said nothing, only gave a single nod, scattered the final handful of salt, brushed his gloved hands together, and walked back toward the porch. He returned the shovel to the exact corner where he had found it, standing it straight as though it had never been used. The two of them remained on the back porch in silence, an arm's length apart, looking out at the cleared alley, their breath rising and mingling in the cold, clear air. While the city around them was so quiet, they could hear the snow settling faintly somewhere beneath a roof. And at that moment, the baby kicked. It wasn't the soft flutter Colleen had grown accustomed to over the past few weeks, but a true kick, strong, distinct, and determined, like a knock from inside, powerful enough to draw a quiet sound from her lips and make her place a hand over her stomach by instinct. When the second kick came, just as forceful as the first, she did something before she had time to think. She reached for Cesare's hand, pulled the glove from his freezing fingers, and placed his palm against the exact spot on her sweater. The third kick came almost immediately, striking directly into the man's hand, and Colleen saw it pass through him. She saw those gray eyes that nothing seemed capable of moving open slightly wider. She saw his entire tall, powerful body become perfectly still, as though every one of his senses had been ordered to gather at the single point beneath his palm. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Then she removed his hand gently and decisively, exactly as she had placed it there. Neither of them spoke. Cesare looked at his hand for a moment, then turned his eyes toward the alley. Colleen went back inside and set the kettle on the stove, and the only sound in the house was the water beginning to sing, while outside, the sun finally rose above the rooftops of Bridgeport, pouring the first golden light in 4 days across an alley swept perfectly clean, and the kitchen clock read 5:51 in the morning, with 9 minutes left until 6. At 6 o'clock, nothing happened, and for the next 4 minutes the Whitlock kitchen remained so silent that they could hear Static's laptop automatically refreshing the Tribune homepage every 10 seconds. Bruno stood with his arms crossed, Helen sat with a cup of cold tea, Colleen leaned against the dish cabinet, and Cesare stood beside the window looking out at the cleared alley. No one said aloud that if Kessler lost her nerve, every move they had made the night before would become nothing but firewood. Then, at 6 minutes past 6, Static sprang to his feet so quickly that he knocked over his chair. "It's up. It's up," the entire kitchen crowded behind him. The story filled the front page, its headline running across 3 bold lines. Port Workers' Pension Fund drained for 9 years. Evidence found in the handwritten ledgers of an accountant who died in a suspicious accident. Internal documents reveal an approaching port sale and payments to a private security firm. Beneath it appeared the author's name, Dana Kessler, along with a chilling editorial note stating that all original documents had been independently verified and delivered to federal authorities. Kessler wrote like someone who had waited half her life for this story. There wasn't one unnecessary adjective, not a single exclamation, only document placed beside document, number beside number, date fitting into date, prose so dry it caught fire. Near the end, a single line mentioned the elderly accountant, whose records had remained flawless for 26 years. Accompanied by a photograph of the ledger page circled in red ink, its neat, slanting handwriting appearing in the middle of the digital newspaper, like a dead man rising to testify. Helen stared at the photograph for a long time, then stood to pour more tea, and for a while no one saw her face. Everything that followed moved like an avalanche. At 7 o'clock, the story became the most read article on the site. At 8, two morning radio stations read the headline word for word during their prime broadcasts. At 9, Static stared at the number on his screen and read it aloud in disbelief. 40,000 shares. Comments poured in from the Port District itself. My name is on that fund list. My father worked the docks for 30 years. We need answers. By noon, 2 local television stations had assembled breaking reports, using footage of the port gates and the Valenti office building filmed from a distance. By 2 in the afternoon, Static turned the screen toward everyone and showed them the headline running across the Associated Press feed. Allegations of large-scale pension fund fraud in Chicago. Federal authorities confirm receipt of documents and say an urgent review is underway. The story had escaped the city, which meant no telephone call made in Chicago could silence it anymore. But that was what happened on the screens. In the physical world, the second blow of the morning landed at 8:45, inside a thickly carpeted law office on the 11th floor in the Loop, where Gerald Pike, legal counsel to the Valenti family for 20 years, had arrived early to manage the crisis when his pale-faced secretary informed him that 2 gentlemen without appointments were waiting. Before he could say his schedule was full, the walnut door opened to admit one man who nearly filled its entire width and another who was thin, with salt and pepper hair and the eyes of someone who had seen more than Pike wanted to imagine. They didn't storm into the room, they simply walked in. Bruno even closed the door so gently that the latch made only a modest click. Then he placed a briefcase on the leather-top desk, opened the locks and turned it toward the man behind the desk, with the thoughtful courtesy of a banker. "Mr. Pike," Bruno said, his voice as mild as though discussing the weather, "you've read this morning's newspaper. We assume you have. In that case, you'll recognize several documents in here. The backdated authorization your office notarized, the structure of the 3 intermediary companies your office established, and the draft agreement with the foreign partner that your office is holding for final initials. We haven't come to make your life difficult. We've come to save you a valuable morning." Pike looked at the stack of papers, and the hand resting on his desk began searching for something to do, turning a pen, straightening a paper clip. The fingers of a man watching 20 years of his career rearrange themselves into an indictment. "I only prepared documents according to my client's instructions," he began. "I had no obligation to verify." Doc, who had stood silently by the window studying the skyline since entering the room, turned and spoke for the first time, his voice as gentle as though reading a prescription. "Mr. Pike, you have 2 choices. You can discuss this here and now with us, people who aren't recording you, placing you under oath, or serving a subpoena. Or you can save it for the federal prosecutors. I'll mention only one thing from experience. Federal prosecutors ask far more questions than we do, and they ask about matters that have nothing to do with the case at hand. It's a professional habit of theirs." The room fell silent. From the 11th floor they were too high to hear the street. There was only the faint breathing of the air conditioner, Gerald Pike, who had practiced law for 20 years and told himself each night that he merely drafted documents and had never been the architect of anything, looked at the authorization bearing his own office's notarial seal, looked at the 2 men waiting before him with a patience and politeness that were almost terrifying, and made the calculation every good lawyer made faster than his clients, the calculation of who would be first to receive leniency. His hand trembled when he lifted the desk telephone, genuinely trembled, with no way to conceal it. But the numbers he pressed were precise, each key entered without error. The number belonged to the United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois, memorized by every lawyer in the city. When someone answered, Gerald Pike cleared his throat, gave his name and bar registration number, then said, "I would like to arrange a voluntary cooperation meeting today regarding the matter reported in this morning's newspaper, and I believe I should attend with my own attorney." Meanwhile, across the city, inside the gray stone mansion in Lake Forest, a 61-year-old man switched off the television, rose to his feet, and ordered his secretary to call an emergency press conference for 11 o'clock. News of Carmine's 11 o'clock press conference reached the Bridgeport kitchen through Static's screen. But before the clock hands could arrive at that hour, another piece of news came first through a channel no one expected: Bruno's contact inside the United States Attorney's Office. The contact confirmed that Gerald Pike had been sitting in an interview room since shortly before 10, accompanied by his own lawyer, cooperating so eagerly that prosecutors had to signal for him to slow down. And within the flood of information the attorney of 20 years poured out, in exchange for leniency, was one detail that appeared in none of the documents from the Whitlock basement, a detail important enough for the contact to call in the middle of the interview. Pike testified that 3 years earlier, on the night the elderly accountant was injured, he had been summoned to Carmine's private residence close to midnight to prepare several urgent documents, and the person who drove Carmine home through the gates that night, the person Pike saw with his own eyes through the car window, wasn't Carmine's usual driver, but a woman, the head housekeeper of the main mansion, Verna Sloan. The kitchen fell silent, Static stopped typing, and the final piece turned itself into place before them all. The woman who had stood in the Valenti Grand Hall for more than 20 years, who knew the schedule of every shadow in the house, who had sweetly asked Colleen for her exact address over the telephone, whose office extension called directly to Dutton's firm, had been standing in the darkness of this story far longer than any of them had imagined. Not since the previous week, not since the previous month, but for 3 years, since the night of the parking garage staircase without a camera. But Verna Sloan hadn't survived more than 20 years among wolves without learning the laws of the pack, and her next move left even the most seasoned people in the kitchen silent for a very long time. Early that afternoon, after Kessler's story had spread across the country, and the name Carmine Valenti had begun appearing on television beside the word allegations, Verna Sloan's lawyer approached the United States Attorney's Office with an offer. His client was prepared to surrender a piece of evidence and disclose everything she knew in exchange for cooperating witness status, and that evidence was described in the proposal with a single dry sentence: a secret recording of a conversation inside a car, 11 minutes long, captured on the night Arthur Whitlock died, containing the voice of Carmine Valenti. For 3 years the woman had kept that recording like a life insurance policy, knowing that as long as it remained locked inside her safe, Carmine wouldn't dare touch her. And now, as the ship began to sink, she was the first to throw that insurance policy onto the prosecutor's table in exchange for a place in the lifeboat. Not because she regretted anything, not for a single second, but because it was the correct calculation, and people like Verna Sloan spent their entire lives making only correct calculations. By late afternoon, the official news arrived. The contact called for the second time, his voice entirely different from before. The recording had been surrendered and subjected to an initial review. Its contents provided sufficient grounds. The United States Attorney's Office had made its decision that same day. The case involving Arthur Whitlock's death 3 years earlier had been reopened and reclassified. It was no longer an accident. As of that afternoon, it carried a different name in the system: homicide. When Static finished reading the message aloud, no one in the kitchen spoke. Bruno lowered his eyes to his hands. Doc removed his glasses and cleaned them for a very long time. Cesare rose, crossed to the window, and stood there without moving. Colleen listened to every word from beginning to end, standing straight, her expression unchanged. When Static hesitantly asked whether she was all right, she gave one nod and even said thank you. Then she removed her apron, folded it over the back of a chair, and walked out onto the rear porch, closing the door very softly behind her. Outside, the day was already leaning toward evening. The low winter sunlight slanted across the rooftops and cast long shadows over the perfectly cleared alley, and Colleen Whitlock stood in the middle of the porch with both arms hanging at her sides, staring at the silent white world before her. 3 years. For 3 years she had lowered her head and kept moving because people told her it was an accident. For 3 years she had signed papers that called it an accident, packed away her father's clothes while calling it an accident, taught herself every night to say it was an accident because believing otherwise while being unable to do anything about it was something a person couldn't survive. And now, in a single afternoon, that word had been lifted from her father officially in the records of the United States, and replaced with the truth. Her father hadn't slipped. Her father had been murdered because he had faithfully carried out the duty of a man entrusted with the books. The crying came unlike anything she had ever known. It wasn't the quiet flow of tears from the day she read Aldo's letter. It broke from somewhere deep inside her. her entire body folded forward, both hands gripping the porch railing, her shoulders shaking in waves, each sob bursting white into the cold air. She wept for the father who had lain beneath the wrong word for 3 years. She wept for the mother who had lived 3 years with an instinct no one believed. She wept for herself through all those nights in the hospital corridor. She didn't hear the porch door open again. She didn't hear her mother's slippers. She only felt a hand settle on her shoulder, small, bony, warm, and perfectly still. It didn't rub or pat. It didn't tell her not to cry. It simply remained there like an anchor. Helen Whitlock stood beside her daughter in the winter afternoon, her back straight, her eyes dry, looking out over the alley where fate had begun and where it was now approaching its end. The two women who belonged to Arthur Whitlock stood silently together for a very long time, until the sun disappeared completely behind the rooftops, while inside the house, through the kitchen window, the men quietly looked away, except for one who remained beside the glass, watching mother and daughter with the expression of someone who had just understood that his family's debt had gained another layer. And tomorrow, when the television cameras turned toward his uncle at the press conference, there would be no one left in the world capable of shielding him from the questions about to be asked. The grand conference room of the hotel Carmine Valenti had chosen for the press conference was arranged like a declaration of innocence, a deep blue backdrop, 2 flags, a cherrywood podium, every detail radiating the reassurance of a busy man with nothing to hide. The event, originally called for 11 o'clock, had been delayed again and again throughout the day by his own advisors, in the hope that the media storm would reach its peak and then burn itself out. But the storm didn't fade. It grew larger with every passing hour, and by the time Carmine finally stepped to the podium late that afternoon, his silver hair swept back with flawless precision, his charcoal gray suit tailored to perfection, the warm smile practiced through 30 years as the gentle public face of the family. Word that Arthur Whitlock's case had been reclassified had already reached several reporters in the room, and he didn't know it. He began exactly as expected, using the rich, reassuring voice of a devoted uncle, calling the morning article a carefully orchestrated smear campaign against a grieving family already distraught over the disappearance of its nephew, insisting that the pension fund of the port workers was a sacred matter of honor upheld for 3 generations, promising to pursue the Tribune through every court available. And for the first 3 minutes, the cameras remained obedient. Then the questions began. The first came from a television reporter asking whether he could confirm the agreement with Obsidian Group, and Carmine dismissed it with a smile and 2 words, mere rumor. The second concerned Cesare Valenti's present whereabouts, and Carmine lowered his voice into the precise tone of a worried relative, saying the family was cooperating fully with the authorities. Then, from the third row, a brown-haired woman with her hair tied low rose without a microphone, her voice carrying across the entire room, a stack of printed documents in her left hand. Dana Kessler, Tribune, Mr. Valenti. I'm holding a printed copy of a transfer order for $38,000 from a limited liability company, registered at the address of your office, to the security firm of a former police officer named Ray Dutton. The transfer was made exactly 3 days before your nephew disappeared. Can you explain what services your company purchased for that amount? Carmine's smile remained on his lips, but something behind it had stopped, like a smooth machine suddenly catching on one broken gear. He said he wouldn't comment on unverified documents, and Kessler, still standing, turned to the second page. Then, how do you explain the authorization to withdraw funds bearing your brother's signature, written in an ink that didn't appear on the market until 4 years after the date shown on the document? Mr. Valenti, who in your office controlled the late Don Aldo's seal? The cameras began firing more rapidly. Carmine lowered his eyes to the podium for 1 second, only one, but a close television camera forgave no second at all, and when he looked up again, the smile of 30 years had developed a crack running across it, thin as a strand of hair, widening with every question that followed, because the questions in that room were no longer the hesitant probes of reporters searching for direction. They were the questions of people who had read the entire file, and had come only to confirm each page in front of the cameras. And for a man who had lived his whole life through appearances, there was no more painful way to die than to die on live television, minute by minute, dressed in the finest suit he owned. At the back of the room, leaning against the wall near the exit, stood a man taking no notes. Inspector Ed Lawson, of the Organized Crime Unit, had come under the official explanation that he was merely observing. And throughout those 40 minutes, as he watched the man at the podium stagger beneath the questions, he wasn't thinking about Carmine. He was thinking about the files bearing the Valenti name that had somehow found their way to the bottom of the stacks on his desk, for more than a decade in ways no one could quite explain, about the quiet telephone calls, the investigations that suddenly ran out of funding, the longshoremen from the port district where he had grown up, men who had trusted him when he first put on the uniform, and all the times he had told himself that one small cog couldn't repair the entire machine. Then he thought about the sealed file that had been sitting on his desk since early morning, about his own signature on the request for federal coordination he had signed at 9 o'clock after sitting alone in his office for an hour and a half, and when the press conference dissolved into chaos. Ed Lawson moved through the crowd of reporters, his hand touching the badge at his belt the way a man might touch an old oath, and walked directly to his car. That night, no one in the Bridgeport house watched the entire news broadcast. They didn't need to. The next morning, the Chicago sky was the hard, piercing blue that appears only after a great storm, the kind of blue that made every snow-covered rooftop shine as though plated in silver. At exactly 6 o'clock, federal agents working with Chicago police knocked on the door of an apartment on the city's west side and placed Ray Dutton in handcuffs, the man who had used his 4 hours to do absolutely nothing. At 8:15, 2 government vehicles stopped outside the gray stone mansion in Lake Forest, and Carmine Valenti was led through the front entrance between 2 agents, before the cameras of reporters who had been waiting since midnight, still wearing a wine-colored silk robe and house slippers, while his silver hair, the hair the Chicago public hadn't seen out of place in 30 years, whipped wildly in the morning wind, uncombed for the first time in the memory of anyone who had ever known him. That photograph, the powerful man in a bathrobe beneath the hard blue sky, would appear on the front page of every newspaper in the city the following morning. By 9 o'clock, a federal judge had signed an emergency order freezing every asset and account connected to the intermediary companies, stopping the flow of money before it could be moved, and preserving everything that might still be recovered for the 214 families. And in Bridgeport, Helen Whitlock heard the news on the old kitchen radio, said nothing, switched it off, and continued frying the rest of the eggs for the people in her house. Because, as she put it, justice was the work of a lifetime, but breakfast had its proper hour. That breakfast was their last meal beneath the Whitlock roof, and when Cesare Valenti finished eating, he changed back into the clothes Bruno had brought the day before, a white shirt, a dark suit. The ruby ring returned to its proper finger, and over the next 3 hours, the small living room in Bridgeport became the setting for the most important negotiation in the history of the Valenti family, conducted through the speaker of a telephone placed in the center of the table, with a leading criminal defense attorney, Cesare, had hired the previous afternoon serving as intermediary, while at the other end of the line sat representatives from the United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois. He didn't bargain like a merchant. He placed a complete proposal on the table, one substantial enough to make the prosecutors ask for 2 separate pauses to confer. He would offer limited cooperation as both victim and witness in the case against Carmine, surrender all additional evidence, and seek no immunity for any activities of his own. In exchange, he would enter into a judicially supervised commitment to dismantle every unlawful branch of the family's operations within 18 months, restructure the port and transportation company into a transparent business subject to annual independent audits appointed by the court, and accept one final condition he added in his own handwriting at the last moment, a condition that made the attorney ask twice to be certain he had heard correctly. 2 seats on the new port company's board of directors would be reserved for representatives elected directly by the workers' union. When the call ended with the framework accepted in principle, the room remained silent for a while, and Static, being the youngest and therefore the most honest, blurted out the question everyone was thinking. "What percentage did you just give away, sir?" Cesare stood beside the window, looking out at the little street flooded with sunlight. "More than half," he said without turning around, "measured in money. more than half of everything 3 generations of my family built. And in my profession, there's a word for a man who gives that away voluntarily. It isn't a flattering word. Bruno walked over and stood beside him, and the man of few words asked only one question. Why? Cesare remained silent for a long time, then answered in the voice of someone who had already finished thinking. My father owed Arthur Whitlock a debt he couldn't repay while he was alive, so he repaid it by quietly bringing Arthur's daughter into his house and giving her a place sheltered from the wind. That was his generation's way of paying a debt, quietly and with shame. But he turned to look at Bruno, will repay it differently. I'm going to rebuild this enterprise into something Arthur Whitlock's daughter could clean without lowering her head, something worthy of her cleaning it. Do you understand the difference? Bruno studied him for 3 seconds, then gave one slow, heavy nod, the nod of 20 years. At noon, the cars arrived one by one. Doc carried his medical bag, shook Helen's hand for a very long time, and left behind 2 pages of instructions concerning her heart. Static had a full tin of cookies pressed into his hands, and received a sharp pinch on the ear, along with Helen's warning to watch his language, which left him red-faced and grinning. Bruno bowed before the lady of the house, who stood nearly a foot shorter than he did, with all the solemn dignity of a knight before his queen. Finally, when only 2 people remained on the porch, Cesare reached into the inner pocket of his suit and withdrew a thick cream-colored envelope, without ribbon or flowers, and offered it to Colleen with both hands. She opened it in front of him without ceremony, because 4 days had burned away every formality between them, and inside were 3 sets of documents. The first was confirmation from the nursing school at the University of Illinois, Chicago, that tuition for the fall term needed to complete her Bachelor of Science in Nursing had been paid in full, along with reinstatement papers already completed and waiting only for her signature. The second was a statement from a financial company, confirming that the $32,000 loan in Colleen Whitlock's name had been purchased in full by a third party and permanently discharged, with all negative records ordered removed from her credit history. The third was a long-term lease for a 2-bedroom house located a 10-minute walk from the hospital, where she would complete her clinical training, with a small backyard and 5 years of rent paid in advance. On the tenant line appeared neither his name nor the name of any company he controlled, but Colleen Whitlock, and only Colleen Whitlock, with complete authority over the property, including the right to tear up the agreement if she chose. She stood reading for a very long time, and when she finally looked up and began to speak, he stopped her first, his voice firm as though reciting a legal clause. "Don't use the word gift," he said. "This isn't a gift. A gift is something people give out of affection because they hope to be remembered. This is back pay. The Valenti family owes the Whitlock family 26 years of honest bookkeeping and 1 human life. No envelope could ever hold that debt. This is only the interest. The principal," he looked at her, "I'll repay in another way, with time, and with the company I just promised the federal government I would rebuild from the ground up." Colleen folded the 3 sets of papers, returned them to the envelope, and she didn't cry or throw her arms around him the way women did in afternoon movies. She simply looked at the man before her for a moment, then said in a voice that was calm but warm, "Then I'll accept it as the heir of the chief accountant, and I'll be checking your books, Mr. Valenti. My family has a tradition of doing that." For the first time since the night he opened his eyes in the little room beside the kitchen, she saw the corner of his mouth move. It wasn't yet a smile, but it was the promise of one. As for what he had intended to say in that moment, and why he ultimately said nothing, the answer wouldn't come until 4 months later. Inside a crowded hall in the Port District, before stepping down from the porch toward the waiting car, Cesare stopped, and Colleen, still holding the cream-colored envelope in her hands, suddenly spoke the thought that had remained in her mind throughout the past 4 days. "You know, you never asked me why I saved you, a stranger, in the middle of a storm, when every reasonable thought in the world told me to keep walking." Cesare turned back, and something almost playful flickered across his face, something she had never seen in this man before. "I did ask," he said. "On the second night, when you fell asleep in the chair beside the bed, you talked in your sleep, and apparently unconscious people have no understanding of confidentiality. You said quite a lot about nursing school, about hospital corridors, and about how tired you were, tired of having to be invisible. Tired of passing through other people's lives without anyone ever seeing you? Colleen stood motionless, her cheeks warming in the cold air, and he continued, his voice lowering, every trace of amusement gone. So I didn't need to ask again, because I understood. People don't save strangers in a blizzard because they're braver than everyone else. They do it because they know better than anyone what it feels like to lie there, while the world passes by. He looked directly into her eyes. And Miss Whitlock, before I leave, let me tell you this. You are the most impossible person to overlook that I have ever met in my life. And Colleen Whitlock smiled, not the polite smile of a maid, not the strained smile of a woman accustomed to enduring, but the first true smile she had given throughout this entire story. It broke free without asking permission and illuminated her exhausted face, and the men waiting in the car would later swear that their employer stood there for 3 extra seconds simply to look at it. I'll come back, he said when he had descended the final step, but not now. Right now, I owe the federal government 18 months, and I owe myself the chance to become a different man. I'll return when I deserve to walk through your front door as a guest, not when I have to be dragged through the back door like a debt. Then he entered the car, and the convoy rolled away from the little street in Bridgeport, leaving behind a woman standing on the porch with an envelope in her hands and a spring coming very slowly beneath the snow. 4 months later, the Port Workers' Union Hall was filled to capacity on an early summer morning. Nearly all 214 families were present, elderly men with silver hair wearing the finest suits they owned, wives carrying photographs of husbands who hadn't lived long enough to see this day, 2 federal prosecutors seated in the front row beside Inspector Ed Lawson, and a brown-haired reporter sitting quietly at the far right, with a notebook resting on her lap. Dana Kessler hadn't come to chase a story that day. She had come to witness the ending of the story of her life. It was the official ceremony announcing the complete restoration of the pension fund. Every dollar recovered from the frozen accounts, along with additional compensation drawn from the assets of the man, now awaiting trial on charges whose combined sentences would stretch far beyond the years he had left to live. The organizers had reserved an honorary seat in the front row, complete with a name card. For the woman, everyone in the Port District now called Mr. Whitlock's daughter. But the chair remained empty because Colleen had politely declined it at the entrance, saying she was accustomed to standing. She chose the place that felt right to her, at the back of the hall beside the wall, where she could see everyone, where she could watch silver heads bow and hands rise to wipe away tears when the name Arthur Whitlock was spoken during the opening tribute, where she could see her mother, Helen, seated beside her in her finest cardigan, her back as straight as it had been at 20, and where, inside the portable bassinet resting on the chair between mother and daughter, a tiny life slept peacefully through every round of applause. Ada Whitlock had arrived 1 week before her due date, as though impatient to witness the conclusion herself, healthy and rosy, named for the 2 letters her grandfather had written beneath every ledger page for 26 years, A.W., Ada Whitlock, so that every time her name was spoken, it would serve as a reminder that integrity could be inherited. And in the final row on the opposite side of the hall stood a man who had arrived late and hadn't taken a seat, wearing a simple gray suit without a tie, with no bodyguard within a mile, leaning against the wall, with the careful restraint of a guest who hadn't yet been invited. He was the man who had honored every word of the agreement during the past 4 months, so faithfully that even the federal prosecutors had acknowledged it in their report, and his eyes crossed the entire crowded hall to find one precise point at the far end of the room. Colleen saw him. She looked at him for exactly 3 seconds, the same length of time she had once spent looking down at a hand protruding from the snow, 3 seconds long enough to measure a human being. Then she nodded, one small, calm, unmistakable nod, the nod of someone opening the front door. Across the hall, the man bowed his head slightly in reply, then straightened away from the wall. That was enough for that day. Everything else belonged to time. Because in the end, this story was never truly about an empire. It was about the work no one notices. A line entered honestly into a ledger at midnight, a cup of tea poured at 2 o'clock in the morning, an alley cleared at dawn, a hand placed on a shoulder at exactly the right moment, and a simple truth the world so often forgets, that no human being is invisible. There are only eyes too lazy to look. The maid bent over a floor has a name, a past, and an unfinished dream. The elderly accountant working quietly over a ledger possesses a conscience that can't be bought, and sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to stop for 3 seconds and truly see another human being for an entire city to be saved. So if this story leaves anything with you, let it be this. See the invisible people around you, the person who cleans, the person who keeps the books, the person who carries the bowl of soup. Because a person's dignity doesn't depend on where they stand in a room, but on whether anyone is willing to see them. Thank you for listening to this story all the way to its final moment. If it touched your heart, please press like, share this video with the people you love, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the compelling stories we bring you every day. And what did this story make you feel? Has there ever been an invisible person who quietly helped you in your life? Or have you ever stopped for 3 seconds because of someone else? Please share the feelings from deep within your heart in the comments. We sincerely want to hear every one of your stories. We wish everyone watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, and peace and serenity in every day ahead. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.